Hey everyone, Tactics here with a tank update here for you guys following my video last week where Blizzard, of course, did this big post on tank tuning stating their goals, implemented a bunch of tuning changes, and actually also this week with the beta notes coming out just last night, we saw some additional adjustments, some buffs to some tank specs, some nerfs, and also some reversions of some of these previous nerfs. Now, of course, initial reactions to this post were very negative. And looking back, I do think there's a couple main reasons for that, kind of situated in this first paragraph specifically that stuck out as frustrating to me, with the big one being here at the end here, saying that in some cases we've seen, tanks being able to self-sustain being the reason why groups are not running a healer, where in my opinion, this is just outright false. I think things like dungeon design, where there isn't enough raw damage, is much more at fault. I think, DPS specs having access to a lot more defensive, self-healing, and off-healing capabilities is a big problem. Of course, that also kind of disputes this thing here where, they say tanks have been more durable compared to non-tank characters, which again, I think is false. But I'm not going to get too deep into this. I've talked about this a lot over the past week, both in my video and on stream. But despite disagreeing with a lot of the stuff here, I do think their goal in this part is a good one, right? Where their goal is to reduce the amount of spiky damage tanks are taking, and instead, while your damage intake is going to be higher, having it be smoother and something that you can actually react to. That is key, something that you can react to. Based on my testing, though, they have missed on this goal, at least so far. Again, it's the first time, a week, I guess, they've put in this tuning. They have time to iterate. I hope that they are able to iterate and achieve this goal, but let's talk about it, because currently, again, I think they have not. Some things right out of the gate to note, of course, infinite scaling system, right? There's going to be some key level where this is impossible, probably some key level above 12 where they should kind of not really care about this goal, right? Where, they're tuning for the majority of players. Totally understand that. That's why most of my testing, actually pretty much all of my testing during this past week, was on a plus 10 key level, which is something that you would expect them to tune around this goal, right? Just it's, you're still getting gear increases at a plus 10. It's the cap at your vault to where you get portals, right? So it should fulfill the goals they're putting out, at least hypothetically. Now, it is important to note that in terms of eye level on beta, we are locked. So in plus 10 keys, we are stuck at 613 eye level, which, to give some reference, is 2 out of 6 hero track, right? So it is a tad low maybe for doing that content, but it's not like you're crazy undergeared or anything like that. Now, outside of that, there was also a change that came in after my post last week, which was a compensation nerf to the fortified affix, where they just kind of reduced the damage amp by a flat 10% there. So that is a pretty significant adjustment. Despite that, though, I don't think that they've really done much other tuning across the dungeons in terms of things like melees and tank busters. I still found it relatively common to have any of my deaths that did happen be in the span of 2 seconds. On top of that, too, some of these deaths were like 90% of my damage intake being melees and no actual even tank busters existing in the pack. And we're not talking about pulling like 3 to 4 packs here and I died to 12 to 16 mobs meleeing me. We're talking about pulling one pack and 4 to 5 mobs meleeing me and I just die in 2 seconds flat, right? So clearly something is wrong there. Tank busters make this even worse, by the way. Just use an example. There's like a 4-pack in Mist you can pull that have 2 mobs that have tank busters and then 2 caster mobs, right, shortly into the dungeon. These guys, they sync up their attacks on me. I'm in Incarn. I still go 100 to 0 in Incarn with those 2 tank busters. So that is pretty rough. And again, that's a plus 10 key level. Probably should not be happening at that key level. I think there's clearly a few things that need to happen here in terms of tuning before launch. One, tank busters probably just need to generally have their damage across the board reduced by a bit. Again, they're a big reason for the spikiness, and it's okay to have those spikes exist to a degree, right? But if their goal here is to reduce the peak of those spikes, I think they failed so far, so they need to make sure they are still doing that. And at the same time, potentially putting in the tech to prevent those abilities from casting at the same time as each other to kind of reduce those massive spikes you have if you get unlucky or pull the pack in a weird way or a different way, and all of a sudden those tank busters are synced up, right? That can be very dangerous. 2, they probably do need to look at melee swings themselves, either damage they're doing or the rate that they're coming in, because like I said, again, as a tank, sometimes max of 4 to 5 mobs, you are getting overwhelmed and you are dying in a span of 2 seconds from just melees, which again doesn't seem to fit their goal here of giving both tanks and healers a chance to actually react to that incoming damage. So hopefully those are things that do get addressed. From there, let's move on to the tank specs themselves, where I've done testing on all 6 again in those plus 10ish key levels, and generally I do think the adjustments themselves were less impactful than myself and a lot of other tank creators probably expected initially. So Blood DK, I think the big thing is that there was a really large compensation buff that came in that wasn't listed in this post here. It's not listed here either. Basically what happened is for most of beta, all of beta actually, I covered this in my DK video as well, Bone Storm now uses bone shield charges, but it wasn't giving CDR to rune weapon. That has now changed. So now when you press Bone Storm, you get a fat stack of rune weapon CDR, which is really nice for keys. And I think if you take into the changes into account, right, where you lost the Death Strike healing here, down here, right, pretty significant amount of Death Strike healing that you lost, as well as some, minor DRs here. We gained some armor, but if you take that into account with you gaining the rune weapon uptime, which is, up above 30% in a first patch, I think it's a trade a lot of Mythic Plus DKs would make 100% of the time. And I actually think it's much healthier for how to tune the spec itself, which is actually really nice to see. So, these changes did come in. They were nerfs. Got a compensation bug fix in the process that was quite significant. Blood DK itself, I think, is still relatively self-sufficient. You have maybe some slight issues if you purg, right? Because damage can only be death striked once, so you purg, that's getting into a healing absorb. You probably need a little bit of healer help to get yourself out of your purg, and against like individual, like smaller hits, it can be a little bit tougher as well, especially if you're death striking beyond 5 seconds apart, which is something you want to be death striking fairly consistently on that 5-second kind of timer now in a lot of cases. If you have really high damage intake, you can death strike more often and it's not a big deal, but generally you don't want to be wasting that healing pool, right? So something to, I guess, kind of keep track of additionally here as a Blood DK. But overall, I think, it's still a spec where for the most part, everything is kind of in your hands, still has pretty good damage output. The tuning adjustments this week, just a minor nerf here to Deathbringer and a minor buff here, I believe, to Sandland. So not a ton really happening for Death Knight. I think generally you're probably still pretty happy. If you're a raid Death Knight, you're still very strong. If you're a Mythic Plus Death Knight, you probably actually gained a little bit from the rune weapon uptime, where you can now even get like back-to-back rune weapons on really long pulls. And so I think it's looking pretty decent here for Blood Death Knight. Now let's move down the list here. We got Vengeance Demon Hunter. So Vengeance Demon Hunter was a tank spec that I felt was just generally not super affected. You have a lot of smaller changes here. You have a little bit of stamina reduction, minor DRs, some healing reduction. They obviously reduced the value of the frailty build by a decent bit, so that is something to note. But generally, I don't think you really noticed too much the changes. You are playing a very different build on beta compared to live, right? Like, you've basically fully shifted, and this kind of cements that, where like the nerf to illuminated sigils here, like you're just playing down in flames, or you're playing double brand, you're playing that kind of build. And so it's a bit of a different play style. But especially with Felsguard, this got a massive buff. Felsguard was already, I think, better defensively, significantly in keys, because it gave you additional meta uptime and it gave you additional base tankiness, which was pretty important. They just buffed us by a lot, so I think this kind of cements that you will 100% be playing Felsguard in keys. You are way tankier. It was kind of behind on damage, but this really helps that. You're going to be getting, a bunch of mastery kind of passively from having your sigil out, bunch of agility passively, and then just a bunch of other damage as well. So this is actually really nice to see, because again, it's something you kind of already wanted, and this helps kind of your damage output as a Vengeance Demon Hunter, which is nice, certainly. There's also actually some dungeons right now where, again, target caps, like I'm saying, right, pulling 4 to 5 mobs, a lot of dungeons have target caps where you aren't really pulling too far above that 5 mob target count in the vast majority of their pulls, which potentially makes playing the no spirit bomb builds a little bit more interesting as well, and something that you can do. So something to play around with there. I think Vengeance is probably in a decent spot. Again, they still bring Chaos Brand, so that's very valuable in both the raid and Mythic Plus. And I think, again, well, they're not as fun as they are now, for sure. Obviously that the major changes coming into double sigil, all that other stuff, I think they're still a very solid choice that are probably being underrated by a lot of players because of what they're losing. I still think the spec is in a pretty solid spot. And like I said, these nerfs are relatively low impact. Didn't really notice them too much there. Moving on to Guardian Druid, the other relatively unaffected tank spec here. Things like Frenzied Regen, it's a big nerf number, but I think Frenzied Regen previously did quite a bit of overhealing. There's also a lot of nerfs to either talents that you weren't using or talents that, were already quite weak. For example, Lynn's Favored, this was attack power scaling, no compensation, still does relatively low healing. Ursock's Fury, you weren't even taking it, was doing relatively low healing. Now you're just never going to take it. It's just a dead talent. So a lot of these things don't actually impact you. Pulverized, you were never taking that. Unimpactful nerfs here to a lot of the things, which is, I guess, good for Guardian Druids in the build this week. Ignore this. This is basically just reverts to the nerfs for specifically non-Guardian specs. I believe actually Renewal was just straight up unnerfed, so Renewal is back to normal. But there is a additional nerf, I believe, to Frenzied Regen for Guardian specifically. So Guardian specifically, I could think of, yeah. So Frenzied Regen is nerfed for Guardian specifically still. And they also did add a nerf in, except for instead of on Renewal, sorry, it's on Dream of Cenarius. So they nerfed Dream of Cenarius, they unnerfed Renewal because they buffed your damage here from your tier set as well. So, a bit of a compensation unnerf and then nerfing something else entirely. Again, I don't really think much changes here. It's very much like Vengeance, where you don't really feel a lot of this too much. So it's not really a huge deal for Guardian either. I think you're in a perfectly fine spot. Brewmaster Monk next. This was a spec that people were actually thinking gained a fair bit here. They gained more armor. They gained a bunch more stagger. They lost dodge. Makes them a lot more consistent, of course, when you're not relying on those 100% avoidance things. Though, of course, Elusive Brawler makes that a little bit more consistent. But generally, a lot of Brewmasters were pretty happy with this change. They've been nerfed again I guess, nerfed, not again. They took a little bit of that armor out, so 5% of that armor out. So instead of going up from 25 to 50, it's going up from 25 to 45, sorry. So it's still a buff. And then here, the amount of stagger increase, instead of this being 8, it's 5%. So again, this is still getting increased from what it is currently. However, it's not being increased by this much. So a slight little hit to Brewmasters there, but I don't think this is anything to really worry about. I think generally still the consensus is Brewmaster still kind of gained from these changes relative to the other tanks. So again, if you're a Brewmaster, you're still probably in a happy place. And again, you can see kind of a pattern here so far. Most of the tanks are pretty happy with the changes. Blood DK is feeling it a bit. And also, I guess something else to say about Blood DK is this kind of pushed you a little bit away from haste and a little bit more towards mastery. So you're seeing a lot of people shift to do mastery and versatility as their stats instead of haste and versatility, just because of how these changes impact you. So I guess something else interesting to note there. But now let's get to probably the biggest loser here, and that is Protection Paladin. So Paladin was already probably the weakest tank defensively, I think, on the beta. I think a big thing of that was in attack power scaling. A lot of their heals, the Avenger's Shield Absorb or, Word of Glory itself, are attack power based, and with the 60% stamina increase, which again was already in the game, it was not added last week, it's been in the game the entire beta, but with that increase and not as many compensation nerfs to their attack power scaling healing, they were having a bit of a tough time, and this wasn't helping. Obviously the mitigations that they have up 95+% of the time in your Consecration Mastery, right, your mastery by the way, and your Shield of the Righteous got hits. This was tough. They also massive hits to Sentinel in terms of both duration and CDR. And again, this is not a 4-second flat duration decrease because you extend Sentinel, and having those additional seconds allows you to extend Sentinel more. And then of course, Eye of Tear getting slashed by another 3 seconds as well. I think there's a few things here that I'd like to see. One, I don't really agree with the mastery nerf here. I don't know the exact impact of this. I've heard people saying potentially you move away from mastery now as a paladin, which might suck a little bit, because again, I think mastery is like a good place to have these things that are really strong defensively, potentially for tanks. Maybe having mastery be the best defensive stat for a tank makes sense to me. And I think it is still slightly better than Verse, but obviously Verse doesn't require you to be in or consecrate. Verse has more damage upside, and so I think a lot of people are talking about potentially, Paladin going to haste Verse now because of a 20% nerf to their mastery, as opposed to haste mastery, which would be unfortunate, but that is the current state of things. In terms of compensation buffs, they did get a few. So Shield of the Righteous was brought up a little bit here. So again, it started at 170, got brought down to 150, and is now going to be at 160. I guess low quality of life thing here for Templar, where hammer is now 3 holy power instead of 5. That's nice. Word of Glory healing on yourself is now going to be 300% based on missing health instead of 250. So another boost there to Word of Glory, which is nice. And they've increased the Avenger Shield Absorb healing to 60% of the damage instead of 50%. But again, I don't think this is really enough to make this significant. I think this combined with a 10% Word of Glory is probably going to be actually fairly helpful now with yourself Word of Glories. I think, you know, other target Word of Glories were rather fine, but I think Word of Glory is now probably getting into a pretty similar, pretty okay spot. One thing though, again, please some sort of mana reduction on Shining Light procs so you don't go, I beg, please. Otherwise, I still think Prop Paladin needs more than this defensively to be on par with the other tanks. I would like to see a little bit more buffing. I really don't understand this change. Again, this frustrations with hero talent abilities, like abilities that hero talent trees require you to have, and being in the capstone, and then now being this weak. I would be fine with this if they made Ardent Defender baseline and moved this to the Ardent Defender spot. But with this being a capstone, it's just tough. It's just really tough in my opinion. And I'm the same way about things like Lunar Beam. Right? I think Lunar Beam should not be in the capstone area, right? Any kind of ability that hero talents require you to have to actually function should not be in the capstone tree, at least in my opinion. But obviously Blizzard has a different opinion there, and that's okay. Disagree. But generally, I do think Prop Paladin is the biggest loser of these changes after my testing, and I would like to see them again get probably a little bit more compensation buffs than they've gotten here. I kind of want them to just completely revert this mastery nerf. And yeah, we'll see. Like I think you could completely revert literally all of the nerfs here, and they still wouldn't be like, insanely overpowered or anything like that. You know what I mean? So we'll see, but I would like to see more buffs than what they've done here. And I believe we've got one more, the Warrior, of course. So scrolling down here. Yeah, so basically, similar to Guardian Druid, the only thing they've done here for Warriors is they've made the impending victory nerf not affect the DPS Warrior specs. That is all these notes kind of mean. And so in general here, the big thing I've noticed with Warrior, and actually this also applies to Brewmaster Monk as well, is you are relatively stable. Your damage intake is not, it's relatively stable compared to the other tank specs, but you have a pretty hard time kind of pushing your health bar back up, right? You can keep it stable. You have your ignore pains or whatever to kind of, prevent the damage loss from being too extreme, but you really do need that healer help to bring your health bar back up, which is not something that is super weird or foreign to Prot Warriors and Brewmasters, right? That is kind of consistent with the history of these specs, so it's not like it's the end of the world there. And they do have the flattest damage profile intake, so I think that's fine for them to function in that way. But again, I do think in a lot of cases, some of the damage is too bursty. Like as a Prot Warrior, I was tanking like 5 mobs and I had shield block up 100% of the time, and I was getting slammed by those 5 mobs, right? Like it's not like I had super flat damage intake in those situations. Again, it's flatter than some of the other tanks, but you also have way less self-healing than those other tanks, especially after these changes. So definitely would like to see some adjustments, I think, again, to the mobs and maybe not the tanks to potentially fix that. I don't think this is the end of the world for Prot Warrior. They did lose some utility here. They also got some compensation in shield wall CDR, which is kind of nice. But they were also the tank that was probably hurt the most by the nerfs to Leech because they got so much of it from their talent tree. In general, though, I think they're on the right track, but again, like I said, I think they need to do quite a few more changes in terms of mob tuning. I think they need to probably buff Prop Paladin and bring them up to the level of other tanks. But I will say, in terms of tank tuning, I don't think there's like a clear kind of outlier like there was in terms of Vengeance Demon Hunter in like seasons 3 and 4 in terms of just pure output, at least not yet. Again, that could change, and they're in the tuning phase right now, kind of bringing everything into line, so we'll have to see. And I really do hope, again, that they kind of do actually meet this goal they stated here, because I don't think this is a bad goal, right? I don't disagree with this. I just disagree with some of the other stuff they said in this post. But I'd love to know what you guys think about it. Have you tested on beta at all? Has this changed what tanks you're interested in playing when the expansion launches? Let me know down in the comments below. Of course, got to give a shout out to my amazing Patreon supporters for helping me to continue make all of this content. And I will see you guys in the next video.